So happy that all of you are here, and it's nice to see your faces. And for those of you who are in Cleveland, I'll see you tomorrow, which is a little crazy, but in a good way. Ron, thank you for your image there, your background. So we're gonna jump right in. Each week we've been sort of engaging a little bit where something is inspired from the Parsha, and this text is no different from that. This also includes one of my favorite stories in the Talmud. I say that a lot. I realize that I say all of them are my favorite in some way, but there's a good reason. And it's particularly timely because we were talking right before the class started about weather and snow. And here in the DC area, apparently it snowed for an hour in the middle of the night. None of it stuck in the morning, but we're getting to that time of year, if not already, in which weather and snow is a thing. And our piece of Talmud today speaks about weather, speaks about snow. So that should be hopefully interesting. The PDF that I normally print, I missed a paragraph, so I'm going to share from Sefaria first, and then we'll work from there. Can everybody see this screen? Oh, let me make it a little smaller. Can everybody see that here? Awesome. So before we dig in, again, this is the same version you're going to see in the PDF, just online on Sefaria. And for those who might be inclined, I'll drop the link in the chat so that if you want to open it, you can. But don't read ahead too far. Okay, so I want to start off by saying, right, that we have this phrase here, Tanu Rabbanan. Does everybody see that? We've talked about it before, but it's always good to remember that Tanu, right, comes from the word like shana or shane, to like repeat. In Aramaic, shins often become tavs, and in this case, when we see this, we should read the word Tanaim. Right, we're talking about that early generation of rabbis. So Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis, or in this case, it's translated the sages, taught. So we're going to start here. Can I get a volunteer to read this paragraph for us here? Anybody want to start us off? Bob, please. Oh, you're still muted. There we go.
Apropos the great wealth of Rabbi Elazar ben Harsam, the Gemara cites that which the sages taught. A poor person and a wealthy person and a wicked person come to face judgment before the heavenly court. I think I've heard this story about a bar.
Right. There are a number of jokes that start in similar ways.
For their conduct in
jokes
this
are now
world.
Talmudic if we want to. All right, go
on.
Was the wicked person poor or wealthy?
At this moment, we're treating them as three separate categories.
To the poor person, the members of the court say, "Why did you not engage in Torah?" If he rationalizes his conduct and says, "I was poor and preoccupied with earning enough to pay for my sustenance, and that is why I did not engage in Torah study," they say to him, "Were you any poorer than Hillel, who was wretchedly poor and nevertheless attempted to study Torah?"
Okay, so here we get our sort of inkling of where this section of Talmud is going to go. We have this sort of contrived scenario in which we have three categories of people: poor, wealthy, and wicked. Again, we could probably come up with many, many more categories of cutting people up. Here the Gemara is doing this. And they come to face judgment before God, right, before the heavenly court. And each of them is going to be asked the question, why did you not engage in Torah? Now, we already are starting to get a sense of what the rabbis think is most important. First, right, that the rabbis care about engagement in Torah. That's the question they ask. Now, in a different scenario, in a different text, they ask, were you honest in business? There's another famous section that asks a similar sort of scenario to people. Here we get that. And the first comparison is, if someone who is poor, according to this story, says, look, I was busy, like I was trying to make enough money to pay for my, for food to get on the table, that's why I didn't engage in Torah. And the heavenly court seems to suggest that that's not a good answer. And they say, were you any poorer than Hillel, who was poor and nevertheless studied Torah? And each of these is we're going to get a story and example. We're going to read the Hillel one in a second. Before we read the story, what do we think about this framework? About the categories or the question, or even how they're going to respond? We already get a sense this is going to be a pattern. Were you, this person, is a scenario, they're going to have some sort of excuse, and the Gemara is going to reject that excuse. What do people think about that framework?
Well,
Yeah.
it's a good way to make a point.
There literally no excuses, right? That's the Gemara's takeaway. Nelson.
Well, but I think what they're going to, I assume what they're going to say is someone else with your same problem managed to do it, and therefore you could too. But I think that comparison may be unfair.
I think you're exactly right that is the comparison they're going to make, and it probably is unfair. I mean, we probably wouldn't be made feel better by a comparison like this today, right? How is this really helping? Now, I think the important part of this is that the rabbis are very literally making, this is a contrived scenario. These people are dead. They're in the heavenly court, right? So this is not a real story, real scenario. And so we have to then ask ourselves the question, what are the rabbis teaching by telling this story, not to dead people, but to living people? Yeah, Nelson.
Well, we have a complicated architecture for the heavenly court, maybe. So is there an option for the heavenly court to send these people to Gan Eden, or is it just a lesser good section, or what are their options?
Yeah. What is the menu of post-death options? There is no one authoritative answer. Nobody's come back to tell us. But the rabbis, in broad strokes, understand that the world to come, the sort of next iteration of the universe, whatever that might look like, is a place in which everybody ultimately gets to, but maybe not straight away. So that there are places, underworld and other things like that in the various mythologies that the rabbis entertain, but almost all of them are temporary before receiving, experience with the divine. Again, I wouldn't call myself an expert in this, but that would be the broad strokes. Yeah, Nelson.
I'm sorry, I had the story that I got from my late wife, so I can't really. It's a Yiddish folktale about a pious man who always chose lesser things, and when he gets to heaven, he asks. They offer him a prize because he was so pious, and he says, "Oh, can I have a little butter on my bread?" But I take it that's a story against this story.
We haven't gotten that far yet. So let's hold that to the side. It's a cool. I love the imagery. Let's hold that, because I don't think the lesson for this story is about death per se. It's about how we act in life. So let's come back to it. All right. So
I'm gonna guess that the where this is going is whether you're poor, wealthy, or wicked, you're still supposed to study Torah.
You betcha that is the answer. The rabbis always, the answer with the rabbis is always, you should probably study Torah. Okay, sorry, I'm just rearranging the screen a little bit. Okay, so this is the next paragraph. I just forgot to print it on the PDF, and so here we are. Okay, can I get Ron, since you are you're guessing ahead, why don't you read the next paragraph for us? We have now, right, were you any poorer than Hillel? And here we have the story of Hillel. Ron, will you read it for us?
They said about Hillel the elder that each and every day he would work and earn a half dinar, half of which he would give to the guard of the study hall, and half of which he spent for his sustenance and the sustenance of the members of his family. One time he did not find employment to earn a wage, and the guard of the study hall did not allow him to enter. He ascended to the roof, suspended himself, and sat at the edge of the skylight in order to hear the words of Torah of the living God from the mouths of Shemaiah and Avtalion, the spiritual leaders of the generation.
Okay, let's pause there before we get to the end of the story.
Now I have to go look at the Hebrew and see if that's the right words. The right.
Yeah, it's the name is Shemaiah and Avtalion. Okay, before we get to the end of the story about what happens on the roof, I want to name a few things. First of all, this is the Hillel of Hillel and Shammai. So just to give you some context. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, until the Tanaim, and even then, where you have Rabbi Yehuda, Hanasi, and other characters, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, who are all sort of in a cadre together, the period preceding them was known as the period of the Zugot, of the pairs. Not P-E-A-R-S, but P-A-I-R-S, pairs. I mean, I guess it could be also pairs. I can't speak to the agriculture of the time, but and Shemaiah and Avtalion were the pair of sages most famous in the period before Hillel and Shammai. So there are a number of different pairs. Shemaiah and Avtalion are the Hillel and Shammai of their day. Okay, let's pause for a moment also and read this note and this background, because I think that might help us here. So let's start off with the note here at the bottom. A half dinar is a very low wage, even for unskilled laborers. And according to tradition, Hillel the elder worked for part-time chopping wood for that negligible payment. So that's what he did for a living. He chopped wood, and it still wasn't very much. Okay, now, guard at the study hall. Throughout Jewish history, attitudes have varied with regard to payment for Torah study, especially at the highest levels. Apparently, in the early generations, the preference was to have students of means who are not financially dependent on the community and were thereby free of the pressure that could accompany such support. Therefore, a fee was charged to enter the study hall. These fees were abolished by Hillel, we're going to come to that in a second, when he assumed his position of Nasi. Still, for several additional generations, guards were instructed to restrict entry to the yeshiva to students. Elsewhere, the Gemara notes that Rabban Gamliel, who is after Rabbi Hillel, is saying, any student who's inside, his thoughts and feelings are not like his outside, his conduct and his character traits will not enter the study hall, which greatly limited the number of students. A fantastic section of Talmud that perhaps we will learn another day. Following severe upheavals, including the temporary impeachment of Rabban Gamliel of Yavne from his position as Nasi, this restriction was rescinded and the doors opened to all. We have not really studied any of the political machinations of the rabbis, but there are many of them and the stories are quite brutal. And then here we have an image of a skylight, a Roman skylight. So you can sort of get a sense of what that image looks like. Okay, so we have Hillel every day is working for a very insignificant amount of money, half of which he is giving to his family, and the other half of which he's using to pay the guard at the study hall. However, one time he didn't find enough money. He didn't have enough money. The guard wouldn't let him in. So he climbed up onto the roof of the Beit Midrash and sat at the edge of the skylight to listen to Shemaiah and Avtalion teach Torah. So already we've got ourselves set for just a powerful moment. Can I get another volunteer to read where it says
was this half dinar? Was it the same fee for everybody, or was half dinar the minimum? Or
that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. That's a really fascinating question. Like, what was the entry fee, the ticket price to the Beit Midrash? That's a great question. I have no idea. That's fascinating.
Because I have to believe that nobody else was getting in for a half dinar, because like you said, it was just a pittance.
Right, it's half of a pittance, if you will.
Right.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? And how is the guard being paid? Is this the payment for the guard themselves? What power does that lead? Good questions that I don't know the answer to. All right, can I get another volunteer to read the next paragraph, please?
The sages continued.
Karen, I'll come to you next. Yeah, Nelson, go for it.
The sages continued and said that that day was Shabbat Eve, and it was the winter season of Tevet. The snow fell upon him from the sky. When it was dawn, Shemaiah said to Atalion, Atalion, my brother, every day at this hour, the study hall is already bright from the sunlight streaming through the skylight. And today is dark. It's perhaps a cloudy day. They focused their eyes and saw the image of a man in the skylight. They ascended and found him covered with snow 3 cubits high. That's a lot. That's high.
Yeah.
That's Cleveland high. They extricated him from the snow, and they washed him and smeared oil on him. And they sat him opposite the bonfire to warm him. They said, this man is worthy for us to desecrate Shabbat for him. Saving a life overrides Shabbat in any case. However, this great man is especially deserving. Clearly, poverty is no excuse for the failure to attempt to study Torah.
All right. So before we come to the conclusion that Rabbi Steinsaltz is giving us, let's unpack the story. So it's Erev Shabbat. He climbs up on top. So that's probably a Friday. It's Tevet, which is the month that's coming after this one, right? So we're in Kislev, which is where Hanukkah begins, and Rosh Chodesh Tevet is in the middle of Hanukkah. So it's really like 2 weeks from now, right? A week and a half from now is what we're talking about. Shmai and Avtalion are sitting in the hall, and it's dark because Hillel has fallen asleep on the skylight, and people can't, and the light hasn't come in. They go up there and they find him the snow 3 cubits high, covered in snow. A cubit is the tip of your finger to the tip of your elbow, right? That's that distance, which in easy, simple math is about 18 inches, right? So we're talking about 1.5 feet times 3, right? So we're talking about 4.5 feet of snow, right? I mean, that's a lot of snow to start with. Also, in Babylonia, it's a tremendous amount of snow. They get him from the snow. They wash him up. They put oil on him to help him accumulate heat, and they sit him next to the fire. And then they say this person is worthy of us to desecrate Shabbat for him. Now, that response is really interesting. Rabbi Steinsaltz resolves it by saying every person is worthy, right? And Hillel is especially worthy. Right? What else might this mean, right? Where this person is worthy? Why Shmai and Avtalion presumably know who Hillel is, but let's imagine that they don't know who Hillel is. What could this mean? Why might they say this?
So,
yeah, Karen.
Just because this person wanted to listen to what was going on in the Beit Midrash so much that even if it's not Hillel, they don't know who it is, but he allowed himself to sit up there in a horrible conditions, right? Isn't?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he's worthy because of the extraordinary effort he has put in for mere words of Torah, right? Jackie, did you have something to add?
Yes, he went into a dangerous place.
Yeah. And especially in context of last week where we said you shouldn't put yourself into danger. Like,
Right.
I mean, perhaps they shouldn't be saying such nice things about it. Maybe they said, you're being stupid. Why would you put yourself into danger? Dafka, the Talmud tells us not to do that. But he did. He put himself in tremendous danger. Okay, David, Bob, Nelson, Bill.
So I'm not probably adding too much more to what I think it was Jackie just said. But not only is he putting himself into danger, he's doing it Erev Shabbat when theoretically he should be preparing for Shabbat. So in a sense, what they're almost seem to be saying is that listening to words of Torah almost overrides everything, except maybe what Steinsaltz is adding about saving a life. Because he's not preparing for Shabbat, he's putting himself in a dangerous position. He's actually possibly risking being stuck up there for Shabbat. What if nobody noticed him?
I mean, he's clearly risking death. I mean, to be in 4 feet of snow for any extended amount of time, you know.
And anyone who comes to rescue him is at risk too.
Didn't even think of that. Absolutely right. Them climbing up there he's put Shmai Naftalion to risk. A wonderful addition. Bob, Nelson, Bill.
It's interesting that they assume his motive. It's a made-up story where his motivation is automatically understood by them, as opposed to why would there be anybody on the roof, and should lack of funds have denied a regular member of the class. That isn't addressed at all. It's a made-up story to make the point that they're trying to make, that, and it assumes his motive and it assumes their response, and okay. It's a device to tell us an opinion.
For sure. We have no idea of testing the veracity of the story, and we have an omniscient narrator in the previous paragraph telling us Hillel's motivation. But if we don't know that, we have no idea what this person's motivation is. Now, again, Shmai Naftalion probably know who Hillel is because the population is very small. But since our example is that we don't know who he is, right? Who knows why he's there? And even though perhaps they don't know why he's up there, their treatment is to treat him humanely, nonetheless. And maybe that's a piece of the Torah that we need to learn from this also. Nelson, and then Bill.
Well, it's not just that they don't. We have to assume they don't know. I think we have to assume they don't know who he is, because they don't say, "Hello, what are you doing here?" They don't know why he's there, and they assume he's a great man, as if that makes it worthy to take care of him. Steinsaltz's addition that saving a life overrides, I think, is really important, because that should be their first motive.
Yeah, it's a little uncomfortable that they don't start with that, right? That they don't say, "Look, this person is in danger. We need to get this fire going to save them," even regardless of who they are, right? But what they say is, "Ra'ui zeh l'chalel Shabbat alav." This person is worthy. It's appropriate to do that. Bill, and then Ron, and then we're gonna read the rest of the story.
Yeah, I don't see what they did that was desecrating Shabbat. Even if lighting the fire was done before Shabbat.
Yeah, it's probably unlikely that the fire is going to have survived until the next day without someone tending it. But and smearing oil is also sort of on the edge there. But yeah, right. It could have been that they, because it was winter and because it was starting to snow, they actually prepared lots and lots of materials to make sure that it was warm enough for the next day, which was Shabbat morning, right? They're in the Beit Midrash on Shabbos morning, right? That to make sure that it was warm enough. I think we're supposed to understand that they tended the fire so that it would be hot enough, but it doesn't actually say that.
Yeah, are you allowed to add logs to a fire on Shabbat if it's already started?
No.
So how do they keep warm in the olden days?
You prepared in advance. You built spaces that would retain heat, and you'd wear lots of clothes if you could. And look, this is Babylonia. It probably didn't snow all that often. You know, I mean, I lived in Israel when it snowed, and it was very cold. But it doesn't snow in Israel very often. You know, geographically, it's not so far away from this. But yeah, it's good. Again, perhaps Bob is right, which is to say the story is equally as contrived as our original scenario. But it's interesting nonetheless, especially since we were talking about weather. Ron, and then we're going to read ahead.
Yeah, I hope I remember what I was going to say. One thing is that, I mean, they looked up at the skylight because they expected the sun to shine through. Well, they had 3 cubits of snow on the ground. Did they expect it not to be on the roof too, covering the porthole? What do you call it? The skylight? I mean, that's kind of silly. That's number one. Number two is, once they got up there and saw who it was, they knew who Hillel was, because he was coming to the study hall every day. So as soon as they figured out who it was up on the roof, they knew exactly who he was. And I had a third point, and I don't know what it was.
I'm sure it'll come to you. But you're right. It is more likely that they knew Hillel than they didn't. Even though I've set us up to think about what it would look like for us not to know Hillel. But you're right. It's more than likely that they knew Hillel. And you're right. For 4.5 feet of snow, they probably would not have seen very well out of the skylight. So again, a little contrived, but really here to make a point. All right, Bob, and then we're really going to move on.
I'm no expert, but I think in those days skylights were open. So there would have been snow on the floor.
Yes.
That's how smoke from the fire got out.
Yes, but they could have had the hole partially covered. That snow was that the snow was stacked up. I mean, that's certainly possible. But you're right. If you look at this picture, it's not, they didn't have glass, sitting in the skylight hole, right? All right, let's read ahead. Okay. Karen, I think it was your turn to read.
Yep. Okay. All right. And is that where we are? Okay. And if a wealthy man comes before the heavenly court, the members of the court say to him, "Why did you not engage in Torah?" If he says, "I was wealthy and preoccupied with managing my possessions," they say to him, "Were you any wealthier than Rabbi Elazar, who was exceedingly wealthy and nevertheless studied Torah?" They said about Rabbi Elazar ben Harsum that his father left him an inheritance of 1,000 villages on land, and corresponding to them 1,000 ships at sea. And each and every day he takes a leather jug of flour on his shoulder and walks from city to city and from state to state to study Torah from the Torah scholars in each of those places.
Okay, so now we have the opposite, right? If we're creating a spectrum here, right? We have the person who's poor, who can't, who's really seeking sustenance on every level, and we have Hillel as an example. Now we have the other side, someone who's profoundly wealthy. We have Rabbi Elazar here, who's being compared. Right, he's got 1,000 villages of land worthy, of size, and 1,000 ships at sea. Tremendously wealthy, right? And every day, right, he's going to each place to study Torah. Now, again, whether it is unlikely that Rabbi Elazar either had that many resources or was really walking from city to city. But again, in our contrived scenario, the rabbis are trying to tell us there is no good excuse. It doesn't matter how many resources you have. There's time to make Torah. And here we get a story. Karen, you want to read a little bit more?
Okay. All right. One time, as he passed through the villages in his estate, and his servants found him, did not recognize him, then, thinking he was a resident of the town, they pressed him into service for the master of the estate. He said to them, "I beseech you, let me be, and I will go study Torah." They said, "We swear by the life of Rabbi Elazar ben Harsum that we will not let you be." The Gemara comments, "And in all his days, he never went and saw all his possessions and his property. Rather, he would sit and engage in the study of Torah all day, all night."
So this, I actually think, is a profoundly uncomfortable story. Let's read the notes before we unpack it. So we have the language here, service, which means forced labor for the government, apparently, which basically we're talking about is slavery. Right? They brought him into slavery. Okay, beseech you, or here we are, the notes. I beseech you to let me be. He did not reveal his true identity because he feared they would not believe him, and he did not want to waste time that he could be devoting to Torah study by proving his identity to them. That's according to the Maharsha, right? I think a bit of a stretch, I think, but interesting nonetheless. He never went and saw. This explains why his servants didn't recognize him, which is he wasn't going around from place to place. He was studying Torah. He wasn't visiting his wealth, his villages, to as part of his as a manifestation of his wealth. So first of all, the idea that they would press him into slavery, deeply, deeply problematic. Second of all, they swear by the life of Rabbi Elazar ben Harsum that it was okay, which again, level 2, pretty uncomfortable and problematic, right? That not only are they putting him into slavery, but they're blaming him in order to do that. And then third, the takeaway. It wasn't that the Gemara doesn't say, and that was all bad. No, they didn't recognize him because all he was doing was studying Torah. Yeah, Nelson.
I don't like your use of the word slavery.
Okay. It's forced, it's required forced labor.
Well, forced labor. We force people into the military. And in other places, we require our kids to do things. Sometimes we require students to do things. It's both slavery in the sense in which they don't have much control over themselves, but it's not like they're bought and sold and they can't go home at night, or there are levels of it. And in the United States, I like the word slavery for what we did to blacks.
I hear the distinctions you're making. I'm not sure that I agree with them, but I hear them. We have forced labor in the United States still, as protected by the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, in which someone who is imprisoned can be required to do forced labor. Again, I'm hard pressed to decide that that's not slavery still, but I don't want to get too lost in the semantics, but I hear you. I'm not suggesting you're wrong. I think I might just disagree, but your point well made. Anyone else? What do people think about this? Not just the story at the end, but this argument about Rabbi Elazar. We talked about Rabbi Hillel at one side, or Hillel, about his commitment to Torah. What do you think about Rabbi Elazar's commitment here? Yeah, Karen.
I'm slightly confused because it said that every day he walked from city to city and from state to state. And then it said, no, in all his days, he never went and saw all his possessions. He would sit and study Torah all day and night. So
what's the distinction there? So
Yeah.
I think what they're saying is that Rabbi Elazar ben Harsum was going to the Torah scholars of the town as opposed to the property he owned.
Okay. All
Right. It's a good and important distinction, right? So instead of going right to the let's imagine, I owned a hotel chain, right? And instead of staying at the hotel where I own it, and I now know all the employees who work there, right, who know me because I'm the owner of the hotel chain, he's not doing that. He's going to the Beit Midrash and he's hanging out there as opposed to where he owns property. I think that's the distinction they're making. David.
It seems to me that the common thread between both stories is the total lack of regard for the material world, which is to say that in the one case, impoverished Hillel is burying himself effectively in snow and doesn't care because it's more important to study Torah, even if the risk of his life under all that snow. And wealthy Rabbi Elazar not only doesn't worry about his property and doesn't seem to have to manage it at all, so they don't even recognize him, but they're pressing him into what I'll call the corvée, which is the French forced labor. And he doesn't even take the time to even remotely try to explain who he actually is, because it's taking away from the time he needs to study Torah. So again, not worrying about his material possessions or even his body, which is being pressed into some kind of labor, as long as he can get to the study hall.
Right, in both parts, in both stories, personal safety is second to studying Torah. Now, I would point out that last week we talked about the study that of not putting ourselves into danger, and perhaps it is these stories. I'm making this up. I have no idea, but I wonder if these stories inform those stories, which is to say, the rabbis don't see this as necessarily a good thing. I mean, they're seeing it as a good thing in this individual narrow context of saying, did you or did you not engage in Torah? We have these absurd examples on either side, and so therefore you have no excuse. Again, a little uncomfortable, a little strange, but certainly here. Ron, and then Karen, and then we're going to read the third unit.
I may be misunderstanding the situation. As I read it, I read that that particular day he was pressed into service, not forever. There was a task that they needed help with.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. I think that is a totally reasonable read of the text. I think that's a very reasonable and probably likely, right? Maybe he was using a resource, and this, he had to go work in the kitchen to pay for his dinner, kind of thing. It's certainly possible. Yeah, Karen.
Don't we have a general principle, chai b'hem?
Yes.
Okay.
You want to just spell it out for me a little bit more?
You're supposed to live by the Jewish laws and with Torah and everything, not die.
Yeah, the rabbis are pretty clear in a variety of different places that there are very, very specific scenarios in which it would be permissible to allow yourself to be killed rather than break Jewish law. And those are not these scenarios, right? Right? They are
Idolatry, murder,
and I think sexual
rape.
impropriety.
Yeah.
So I think these stories are supposed to describe something absurd, right? That these are such extremes that we should almost not take them seriously, right? Just enough to make the point, but not more. Okay, now we're going to get our third story here of this wicked person, which already is a little contrived, all the more so, because if we think about it, if you are studying Torah, God willing, you would not be wicked, right? If you were following the boundaries of Torah, you would not fall into wickedness.
If you're wicked, would you get to the heavenly court at all?
Well, I mean, you're still going to be judged, right? The court is there to judge you. Maybe, but certainly it's a little strange.
This is like a judgment whether you get into heaven.
Maybe something like that. I mean, I think it's borrowing the same imagery we imagine on Yom Kippur, right? In that case, we're being judged while we're alive, and here after the fact. Okay, so our Rasha here, our wicked person, comes to judgment, and the members of the court say to him, this wicked man, "Why did you not engage in Torah?" If he said, "I was handsome and I was preoccupied with my evil inclination, as I had many temptations," they say to him, "Were you any more handsome than Joseph, who did not neglect Torah despite his beauty?" Okay, I'm going to pause here for a moment. We're going to get into the rest of the story, but I want to remind people the story. So our parsha this week, Vayeshev, is split into three parts. The first part is Joseph and his coat and his dreams and being sold into servitude by his slavery by his brothers. The second part of the parsha is the story of Tamar and her encounters with Judah and Judah's promises to her of his sons and the sexual encounter between the two of them. And the third part of the story is that Joseph has found himself, many years later, or perhaps some time later, in a service role in Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife attempts to sleep with him. According to the story, he says no, and she lies, and he is thrown into jail. And it's that in jail that he interprets the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker, which eventually leads to Pharaoh coming to him to interpret dreams. That's next week's parsha. Okay, that's the scenario. So here we have the example. The wicked person says, "Why didn't you engage in Torah?" The wicked person says, "Look, I got carried away. My evil inclination guided me. I let temptation take control of me." And they say, specifically, right, that he is na'e hayiti, right? He's pleasant. He's pleasant looking. Yeah, Bob.
I don't understand the comparison or the joining of handsome and evil.
So evil.
I think it's just a reference to Joseph was also handsome, so handsome doesn't get you anywhere.
I think we haven't gotten to the story of Joseph yet. So your question might be answered, but I think similar to what David is saying, which is that he, because according to this wicked person, he was attractive, that opened opportunities for him that he then took advantage of, that he was inclined to follow because he was getting some sort of preferential treatment. I think it's something along those lines. So they say, okay, were you any more attractive? Basically Joseph was just as attractive as you are, or more so, and Joseph did not neglect Torah. And so here we get the story. Again, we can sort of, whether or not that's the case, again, back to our story, our learning from a number of weeks ago of like, well, did the rabbis like really imagine that these people were studying Torah? Torah hadn't even been given yet. Like, again, we're sort of in this time, there's a word for it, where the time is out of alignment, but I can't remember what it is. It starts with an A.
Liminal?
No, it's not that. It's where the time is it's out. It's like
Anachronistic.
Anachronistic. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Okay. So they said about Joseph the righteous. We're already starting to tell us about who the rabbis think about Joseph. Each and every day, the wife of Potiphar seduced him with words. Right? Was trying to convince him with words. Right? As opposed to physically trying to seduce him. In addition, the clothes that she wore to entice him in the morning, she did not wear to entice him in the evening, meaning to say she was constantly changing her clothing in a way to try and attract him. The clothes that she wore to entice him in the evening, she did not wear to entice him in the morning of the next day. Regardless of the clothing, I think we're supposed to understand the tremendous effort that Potiphar's wife is putting in. One day, she said to him, "Submit to me and have sex with me, have relations with me." He said to her, "No." She said to him, "I will incarcerate you in the prison." And he said to her, this is now Joseph saying to Potiphar's wife, "I do not fear you, as it is stated," and he quotes from the book of Psalms, which presumably is written by King David many generations later, "God releases prisoners." Right? Again, the rabbis are bending time and space here. So meaning to say, she threatens him. If you don't do what I want, I'm going to put you in prison. And he says, God releases prisoners. She says to him, "I will cause you to be bent over with suffering." Joseph responds, "God straightens those who are bent over," from Psalms. You might notice these are also quotes from Birkot HaShachar. Hashem zokef kefufim. Hashem pokeach ivrim. Actually, that's the next one. But either way, Hashem matir asurim. Right? These are things the rabbis would know. These are texts the rabbis would know very well. She says, "I will blind your eyes." He says, God opens the eyes of the blind. Right? Pokeach ivrim. She then, right? So she's attempting different ways to try and convince him to sleep with her. She says to him, 1,000 talents of silver, a tremendous amount of money, to submit to her, to lie with her and be with her. That's the quote from the Parsha, and he refused. Here's the rub. Here's the part that sort of blows my mind, makes me a little crazy. The Gemara elaborates had he submitted to her to lie with her in this world, it would have been decreed in heaven that he would be with her in the world to come. Which is to say that if he had said yes to her in this life, he would somehow be attached with her in the world to come forever. Therefore, he refused. There's another text in which he says yes, but also a little no. There's a number of texts that really unpack this in interesting ways. And so here we get the end, right? So meaning to say, there was no consequence. There was no threat that she could make that would make him say yes, right? Because of the consequences of the world to come. Again, we're bending time and space here. The whole conversation is happening with the heavenly court, right? So we're like already sort of in this funny mystical place. Therefore, he refused. Consequently, Hillel mechayev et ha'aniyim, obligates the poor to study Torah. Rabbi Elazar ben Harsum obligates the wealthy, and Joseph obligates the wicked. Which is to say, he could have let temptation control him and chose not to. And here we get starting a definition of what does wickedness mean to the rabbis. For each category of people, according to Rabbi Steinsaltz, there's a role model who overcame their preoccupations and temptations to study Torah. Okay. What do we think about this example from Joseph? It is a little wacky, I grant you. The Gemara is like that sometimes. What about the conclusion, right? Not just the example of Joseph, but that there is no excuse, that there is someone in which we can rely on to be a good example, to be a role model for us. Yeah, Ron.
I'm probably way off here on this, but I look at this as Mrs. Potiphar was the wicked, and Joseph overcame the wicked to be able to study Torah. Not his wickedness, but her wickedness.
I think you can make the analogy that the wicked person who succumbs to temptation is mirrored in Potiphar's wife, because she too was seeking to fulfill her temptation, and that Joseph did not do that. It doesn't create a one-to-one, because the whole point is that the wicked person is getting preferential treatment, and therefore presumably so was Joseph for same reasons. But you're right. All of them, in every part of this story, it's about, am I going to let myself be tempted to do the wrong thing? And so I think she falls into that category as well, certainly. Karen? Sorry, Ron.
There's a midrash, and I just heard it recently, and I don't even remember where I heard it, about her being a dream interpreter, number one, and number two, that she was being fruitful, trying to be fruitful and multiply because her husband didn't give her a son. So she was looking for another way to do it. And that she knew, because of her dream interpretations, that who was going to come, I was going to say King David, I can't remember who was going to come from her, and that was fulfilled through the midrash anyway, because Joseph had children with her daughter.
Huh. I've never heard that before. That's fascinating.
I'm going to have to go figure out where I heard it.
Yeah, I would love to. If you find it, please send me an email. I would love to read that. Yeah, I think that midrash, it fills this sort of inclination, which is for both the rabbis manifest this, and I think we do too as moderns, which is that we want to rescue the characters in the Tanakh from being terrible, right? Like Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery. Like, we so badly want them not to be the bad guys, but they're sort of the bad guys in the story, right? We want King David to be the good guy, and he sends like some woman's husband to the front line so he can have sex with his wife. Like, that's bad guy territory. And so I think the midrash and the rabbinic inclination, I think our modern one in some way too, is we want to rescue them. We want them to be less terrible. And part of, I think, what makes the Jewish tradition so wonderful is our willingness to try and do that, but also our knowledge that sometimes they're just not like, they're not perfect characters. They do bad things. They're not perfectly good or bad. They're complicated. Karen.
So this is not what I was going to say before, but just what you said now, except poor Esav, who really didn't do anything. And the Midrash makes him into this evil guy. And he's whatever. But what I was going to say as far as this one is the rabbis, as far as I know, think the perfect heaven would be that you get to study Torah 24 hours a day. And so what they, at the very end there, where they said if he had succumbed to her, he would have had to be with her in the world to come. They're telling you that like that's the worst punishment, and then by studying Torah, that's your best reward. I think that's where they're doing with all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think on some level I love, my favorite image of the world to come is like the Beit Midrash, the Yeshiva Shel Mala. I always find that personally meaningful. And I think here there is a tension between what the consequences of our actions are, but I also think the audience, obviously, is people who are reading it who are still alive. And then if we imagine this like in previous texts that we've learned, and we understand that Talmud is not a law book, but a book of pedagogy, like of a way of approaching the world. The rabbis are so clear to say there are no, like, studying Torah is important, and it needs to be a part of your life, regardless, like in addition to whatever consequences of studying Torah in the world to come. Now in your life, Torah needs to have a role. Yeah, I mean, these stories are trying to do something. Yeah, Nelson.
Well, I hear you saying that, but I don't think it's quite true. So we have 3 stories, and in 2 of them, the characters are being before the court to be judged. They have no particular fears. Joseph has a fear. He is motivated in the story by his fear that he'll be assigned the same lot in life as Potiphar's wife, same lot in heaven as Potiphar's wife. He doesn't think he's going to get away. And I personally would like to say that you should do these things because they're right or wrong, not because you fear what's going to happen to you in heaven. But that's where the rabbis leave off, or at least in this story.
I think you're exactly right. The other 2 characters, mirrored by Hillel and by Rabbi Elazar, are not expressing a fear of some sort of consequence. And here Joseph is. And I wonder, I'm just sort of thinking out loud, that I wonder if part of that is because we're talking about a Rasha, we're talking about a wicked person who might need a different motivator. Again, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud because your point is really well made. The Joseph and the wicked is clearly of a different category than poor and wealthy, because poor and wealthy does not dictate whether or not you are a good or a bad person, right? But wealthy is a piece of it. Yeah, Bob.
I don't like the whole discussion.
Okay.
They're assuming that these are people who get fulfillment from studying Torah.
Yes.
And they're telling you that this is the way you should live. And people get fulfillment in different. I'm not a creative person, but if you're a creative person, your mind is going in a different direction other than sitting there and studying Torah. If I had to study Torah all day, I'd sleep a lot.
Yeah, so I think your point is well made, which is to say that the rabbis are certainly inclined to encourage others to to emulate the behavior, like they want people to emulate their behavior, which is engagement with Torah. I think it might invite us, your point, to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be la'asok b'divrei Torah, right? To be engaging in Torah. Because if it is merely the review of text, I think the rabbis would agree that we would have missed the point. That engagement with Torah is something greater than just the hearing and repeating of teachings. And so I would agree that this is challenging us to think differently about the phrasing la'asok b'divrei Torah, right? What did you engage with words of Torah? David and then Karen, and then we'll end there.
So following up on that idea and what Bob was saying, I've been in contexts where it seems to me somebody's using stories like this to sort of say that you shouldn't be engaged in all sorts of other things because it's taking away time from Torah. And the implication is studying, not necessarily doing. And I think maybe the problem is taking these stories out of context. For one thing, maybe the context, at least in studying the history of this period, it seems that there's at least a decent historical theory, if not solid understanding, and certainly at least a belief that lots of other people weren't doing what the rabbis were doing. So maybe they write stories like this, as I think you said, as much as anything else, an encouragement. But if you take a more general context, or try to put this in the total context of what it means to, live a Jewish life, it can't possibly mean that everybody should be sitting in the study hall all the time, even though some people might want to say so, and even though some people might want to say that the ultimate world to come is a nonstop study hall. So I throw that out there for whatever it's worth, but it seems to me that we need to think about context and what we're ultimately supposed to be doing with this, because I think there are other places where if somebody's only studying and they're not also doing, that's problematic.
Yeah, I mean, I think two things. One is that the rabbis certainly in the Gemara, for the most part, did work, and they were studying Torah in addition to whatever labors they were doing to provide for their family and community.
I think that whether it's United Synagogue or some other group, or maybe it's Masorti in Israel, there's actually a yellow pages that lists the rabbis by their day occupations to make the point that they in fact did work.
Yeah, I don't think it is a center or center left Jewish organization. I think it's on the right side of that spectrum. But yes, that flyer does exist, and it's really fascinating. But I think I do want to make one other point, which is it's not just that the rabbis were so dramatically in the minority, like there were so few rabbis compared to Jews. Like most people were not engaging in a Jewish life that the rabbis were happy with. Like by far and wide, that is not how people were living Judaism. And so in some sense, they were sort of living in their own world and imagining a Jewish life run by them, as opposed to what it actually was out there. And so I think it is important for us to remember that tension where the rabbis are trying to encourage a lifestyle that most people were not engaging. And I think that I had something else to say, but it's slipped my mind. All right, Karen, go for it.
Oh, I just wanted to tell Bob that when he said about if he had to study Torah all day, he'd fall asleep. The traditional way of studying Torah is with a partner. And so you're taking turns reading out loud and then arguing back and forth. You don't fall asleep because you're engaged. You're not just reading all day. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I would just say that is a good reason to find a good study partner, so that they won't put you to sleep. Yeah. So I think I want to say the following, and then we'll sort of come to an end here, which is that this text from the Talmud, sort of, pulling the story from Joseph and I think pretty uncomfortable story about Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi, and Hillel is making some weird choices, exemplifies an attempt to say, we're going to take all the edge cases. When someone says, I just don't have time, I don't want to put in the effort. The rabbis are saying, these individuals, Hillel, Rabbi Elazar, and Joseph, they are the edge cases. They are the outliers. And if those outliers can make an effort, so can you. And I do think that again, without defining what La'asok b'divrei Torah is, what engagement in Torah is defined by, and I wouldn't exclusively say it is merely studying text. I think that would be a failure on our part to leave it in that category. I do think that it encourages us to make the time to find, and all of you have done that, right? We're here on Thursday studying Talmud together, right? You've made time, right? You are an example of success according to the rabbis, at least as I understand it. And I think there's a great text, I think from Shammai in Pirkei Avot, that says, don't say, I will make time later, because perhaps you won't make time later. And I think this text mirrors that one, which is to say, don't wait. Make time now, because you may not find time now. Don't search for excuses. Make this a part of your life. And by the way, this is true for all of us, right? Myself included, right? Like, it's good not to make excuses. Just do the thing that you know is important. And there are lots of things that fall into that category, right? Gratitude, community, family, ways that we want to make people's life better, generosity, tzedakah, kindness, because perhaps later won't come and you will have missed your opportunity. And I think that if we can take anything away from this, I think complicated and strange and a little uncomfortable series of stories, is that perhaps we won't have time later. We better make time now for the things that are important. And for the rabbis, that was engagement with Torah. Okay, on that note, Shabbat Shalom, an early Chag Sameach, Chanukah Urim Sameach, and for those of you in Cleveland, I will see you soon. The recordings and availability to watch online, I know exists, I think for almost everything, so feel free to tune in. And then I will also say, I am going to do probably some written versions of what we learn in my newsletter for Hanukkah and for other things. Feel free to click that and join the newsletter. And some version of, you'll see if you look back in the last couple of weeks, I'm often pulling from our class, from our Talmud learning, as inspiration for the stuff I write for each Shabbat. And with that, have a wonderful Shabbat and weekend and Hanukkah, and I'll see you next week on Thursday to study Gemara.
Yasher Koach.